And good afternoon, everybody. Charles Moscowitz here. Thanks for joining me. Daniel Savickas is my guest. He's a federal affairs manager at FreedomWorks. He discusses legislative practices with staff on Capitol Hill. Daniel, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
Yeah, good to be with you.
Now, Daniel, that means that you're a lobbyist. Is that right?
Unregistered lobbyist, but that's definitely one way to describe what I do.
Okay. Yeah. And that means that you're in Washington, you're in touch with people who are actually the functionaries of government. You're in the guts of the government over there.
Absolutely, the belly of the beast.
Okay, and you have a very good sense of what's going on. Now, your organization, one of the things that you seem to be taking on is a reduction of onerous regulations. And President Trump promised in his campaign and has made the statement after his inaugural that he would reduce onerous regulations and sunset 2 regulations for every new one that's created. How is that going?
It's going very well. We're well over 2 sunset regulations for every one implemented. I think we're around 6 now for every one that's been put into place. And the president, the administration just this morning implemented a final rule repealing the Clean Power Plan that was put in place under the Obama administration at the EPA, which would give states and businesses more flexibility to invest and innovate in clean energy solutions, including but not limited to clean coal, natural gas, nuclear, whatever it might be, giving states and businesses more power to innovate. And what we focus on at FreedomWorks in our Regulatory Action Center, the program that I run here at FreedomWorks, is we try and educate activists on how to get involved with the regulatory process, because a lot of it goes on behind closed doors, and people like myself have access to it, but a lot of people are not aware of what's going on, or that there's even an opportunity for the public to weigh in on these proposed regulations. So we try and educate them on how they can do that and let them know what's going on here in the swamp behind closed doors that they might not be aware of or find out in the mainstream media.
I mean, certainly one of the best ways to do that is what's euphemistically called transparency, which is to post these bills that are before Congress online somewhere so that people can understand them. High school students can understand them. They should be written in easy language, no more than a certain number of words, with none of these hidden meanings that the lobbyists used to put in there to help a certain industry or help a certain interest group without people even knowing it, because most Congress people don't have the time to read these things, and or they might give a blink to it. And so also I want to be clear that when you say that you're reducing environmental regulations, what you're doing is you're returning these powers to regulate the environment back to the states where they rightfully belong. Now, this doesn't mean, I can hear the left streaking about, oh, this is going to be, they're poisoning the environment. Not at all. First of all, the EPA has well overstepped its original mission to the point where, I think it was a couple of years ago, I don't know if you remember this, but they actually changed a law that was passed by Congress, I think it was the Clean Water Act, which said that the federal government would have some say in regulating navigable waterways. By navigable waterways, we're talking the Mississippi, the Missouri, we're talking about the Great Lakes, we're talking about the big ports. And they removed the word navigable, and thus you could regulate a puddle in someone's backyard. It was a complete attempt by the federal government under Obama and the Democrat Congress to take over private property. There's no other way to describe it. Now, I think that, so we can honestly say that there is an attempt to scale back that kind of overreaching authoritarian power and get back to what actually is sensible environmental regulations.
No, absolutely. And the rule you're talking about, the Waters of the United States rule, was actually just recently revised by the Trump administration, because you're right. It took waters like the Mississippi River and it defined a water of the United States to be any standing body of water that could feasibly impact a tributary. And that got bastardized down to puddles or even wet grass on farmlands used for irrigation.
Right.
could be defined as a waterway that falls under the purview of the EPA and the federal government, which is absolutely ridiculous. And you're right, it was a private properties issue. And this is not specific to the EPA either. A lot of departments have these broad, vague regulations that they put into place that seem well-intentioned on its face, but then you see how it gets abused over time and leads to more government intervention into the economy, into your property rights, and into your lives.
Well, philosophically speaking, they have no authority to make these laws. Only Congress, Article 1, Section 8, has the authority to make laws. The president can sign them, Congress can or veto them, the Congress can override the veto. There's a process. It's the balance of powers. But what happens is that when these agencies, these unelected, bureaucratic agencies, some of which are almost sovereign in their nature, like the one that was set up by Elizabeth Warren, the Consumer Protection Agency, they then decide to make laws using laws that were made by Congress and that have nothing to do with their authority. And they call them other names. They call them guidelines or, points or regulate, whatever they call it. But what they're doing is they're just making laws out of thin air. And it is utterly unconstitutional. And I think that President Trump understands that, and your group understands it. And it gets into an issue that I think most Americans, all Americans, liberal and conservative, should support, which is the right of the people to make their laws through their elected representatives, not these appointed bureaucracies who could make laws in the other way if they choose to.
Yeah, and even just for certainty's sake, if you have the Trump administration deregulating all of this, but then the next administration, say if it's a liberal Democrat administration, God forbid, they come in, they could just as easily snap their fingers and put it all back without any public debate, without any elections taking place. These unelected bureaucrats could just overhaul everything, which is why, even just from a certainty standpoint, if Congress acts on something, that becomes binding law of the land, and you'd have to have committee hearings and debates, and through elected officials who are accountable to the public, that's the only way you could undo the laws that are on the books. Unfortunately, doing everything through these administrative agencies, it can just happen with the snap of a finger, and businesses have no certainty because it could be one thing one day and another completely different framework the next, depending on the whims of whoever is at these agencies doing work. And you also mentioned guidance documents that people, even the secretary, some paper pushers at lower levels will issue these guidance documents that will actually carry force in administrative law, which is blatantly unconstitutional. Even the concept of administrative law is unconstitutional in and of itself. But
That's
for
right.
lower level administrative staff to be pushing rulemakings that impact the entirety of the country, it's absurd.
Okay, Dan Savickas is here from FreedomWorks. Dan, the fact that President Trump is implementing these ideas and getting rid of these fiat laws, these bad regulations, and bringing up awareness, as your organization is doing, to the general public, to me, that one thing validates his presidency and makes his governance something that we all ought to value, because we're moving very far away from that direction. Now, yesterday, President Trump had his official announcement in Orlando, Florida. I thought it was inspiring. I felt fired up by it. What is the atmosphere right now in Washington? What are people saying?
Well, there's a lot of energy, definitely. The Trump administration has done a lot of unorthodox things in Washington, and that was desperately needed here. And talking about the regulations, you look at the Obama administration definitely gave us a regulation nation where these alphabet soup agencies ran amok. But also during the Bush administration, they also added millions of pages to the Federal Register of harmful, burdensome rulemakings. So President Trump kind of transcended partisanship in this way to give us this deregulatory framework saying we need to cut back on all of this, and his motto, "Drain the swamp." That's the essence of what's happening here with the deregulatory efforts. And it's exciting to see him generate this energy behind something that people in both parties were unwilling to look at. And now he comes in and starts bringing the hammer down on these regulations that have been neglected for so long. It's really exciting to see.
It is. And he definitely reiterated, excuse me, that idea, which was that his election doesn't represent just the passing of a administration from one party to the other, but from the bureaucracy, the growing bureaucracy, which has burdened since the early 20th century, by returning it back to the people. So, this is a great message. It's something that he's tried to do, but he's come into a lot of difficulty and opposition from the Democrats in Congress, who have no idea what they want to do with regard to any of these issues, particularly the issue of immigration. And yet he continues to, in spite of them, forge forward and maintain a very successful presidency. Now, you have the word socialism being bandied about publicly now. President Trump, I think, is doing a great job of calling that out and saying this country will never be socialist. It is absolutely, it must be boiling the blood of these leftists who were elected recently to Congress. And I think they're hurting Congress more than anybody and hurting the Democrats more than anyone. I think you know who I'm talking about, this small clique of people. And yet you also have Bernie Sanders, who is a major candidate for the Democratic Party, who calls himself openly a democratic socialist, and who appeared on a major network recently saying that he thinks the American people would be, quote, delighted, unquote, to raise taxes in order to fund Obamacare. First of all, I hardly think anyone is delighted over the idea of getting more taxes. I mean, that's ridiculous. But do you think that what he's saying is fooling people? I mean, are people resonating with that?
I think it is fooling people, because if you look at the way his rhetoric has changed over even just the last few months, first off, it was going to be only the rich are going to pay for your Medicare for all and your Green New Deal. It's only going to be the top 1% who are going to foot the bill for it. And then just a few months later, he says, I think everyone will be delighted to pay more taxes. So now it's not just the 1%. Now it's you, but he says you're going to be happy to do it. And people still think that he's selling them something that's in their best interest, even though he's shifted so drastically in just the last few months. They don't think that it's even remotely possible that he's lying and that they're going to have to shoulder a burden that's far higher than they or their families can handle. And just if you look at socialist governments throughout history, or even look at the simple economics of it, if I were to say, Ferrari cars tomorrow cost $10, we're going to do a Ferrari for all program, Ferraris are $10. The result wouldn't be everyone getting a Ferrari. The result would be Ferrari would stop making cars because it wouldn't be possible for them to do so. And the dangerous thing is that they're trying to apply that same principle to something so necessary and vital like healthcare. The result's not going to be healthcare for all. The result is drug makers are going to have less money to do research and development on their products. Hospitals are going to have fewer resources, and they're going to have to start laying off doctors and cutting back on medical equipment like MRI machines or CT scanners. So even when you look at it that way, so many people think, Medicare for all is going to be the godsend for America. Even if you look at countries in Europe or in Canada where they don't have the best systems, where they have wait times and drug shortages.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, plus you have to take a look at the fine print of what Medicare offers now, which is not a lot.
Yeah.
For the amount of money that you pay in. I mean, that money comes out of your paycheck every time you receive one. It's called FICA. The money goes toward Medicare. Now, I'm not saying that no one is calling for Medicare to be abolished. That's too hot a potato. But to expand it is going to result in everything that Sarah Palin talked about, which is, Corey scores and death panels and waiting lists. And this is exactly what goes on in even the best socialized medical countries like Great Britain and Canada. And they don't report on that because they don't keep statistics on the number of people who are dead. people who didn't get the health care because they had to wait 6 months or a year, or they couldn't get the health care they needed because their Corey score was too low. In other words, the government decides who lives and who dies. So there's a very dark side to this whole endeavor. And yet, I think that it's a pretty safe bet that they're going to use it. They're going to say this. What else do they have to run on? They're going to say that Trump wants to abolish, insurance for people. I mean, which, by the way, is not even true because Trump is actually fairly liberal on this issue. He wants to preserve the aspects of Obamacare, such as the ability of parents to keep their offspring on it until they're 26 years old, and the catastrophic coverage. So what do you see coming down the pike in terms of the debate on healthcare, and how do we frame the debate in such a way that we can advocate for a more freedom-oriented healthcare system that actually does work better?
And one of the first things we have to do is actually have an affirmative solution. I think Republicans kind of got caught on the back pedal when it came to repealing Obamacare because they didn't really have a plan in place and they got caught off guard. So we need to have at least some affirmative solutions in place saying, here's what our plan is, and here's what we can implement today, instead of just screaming no at proposals like Medicare for All or another Bernie Sanders proposal in the legislature to tie drug prices in the United States to those in Europe, which would have horrific economic consequences if that's implemented. So there are a few things we can do. We can look at pharmacy benefit managers like CVS Caremark, where they get secret closed-door rebates that incentivizes drug makers to mark up the prices so they can then mark them down, and the pharmacy benefit managers like CVS will get a kickback, and patients don't see any of those savings. It's a warped incentive structure, and if we just introduce a little bit of transparency to that space, that would naturally drive drug costs down in the U.S. And we can also look at some patent issues where we make it easier for generic drugs to get to market and introduce competition. That's something that the Trump administration has focused a lot on at the FDA and HHS, introducing competition and driving prices down that way. So I think there's a lot we can do. And unfortunately, Bernie Sanders is occupying this space all by himself because he says, I'm the only one who has a bold, unique plan. And the Republicans haven't pieced it all together yet, but there are a lot of things that we can start emphasizing ahead of the 2020 election to be major players in this space and counter Bernie's Medicare for All narrative.
So, Dan, you're there in Washington on the inside, and you're talking to the people who actually run the show over there, which is the staffers.
Yes.
In the congressional office, right? I mean, the congressmen are out there showboating, that's fine, but it's the people in the office that actually write the laws, they write the code. Are they planning on developing some kind of a comprehensive healthcare plan? Because you're right in that it was very, very disappointing that the Republicans controlled Congress for 6 years and they didn't do a damn thing.
Mm-hmm. There are rumblings that there's a plan set to come out sometime later this year or potentially early next year. I haven't heard too many details about that, but there are plenty of piecemeal approaches coming from Congress, talking about the pharmacy benefit managers issue I was talking about. And there are a lot of bills on patent reform and generic competition. So there are definitely a lot of good staff on Capitol Hill who are working on these issues, albeit not in a comprehensive way yet, but hopefully it'll all come together at some point later this year where Republicans can actually get behind it, where we won't have a Susan Collins type to tank healthcare reform. We might have to wait a little while because Nancy Pelosi is in control of the House right now, and I don't think she's going to give the Republicans a win on healthcare right before the election, sadly.
Right, which means that, I mean, just from a strategy standpoint, it's going to have to be done quietly and with small pieces, little bit at a time. There's not going to be a big splash where there's going to be a signing ceremony on the White House lawn. That's just not going to work and the same thing with immigration. A couple of days ago, President Trump announced that he's going to enforce the laws on immigration, particularly with regard to people who have been given a warrant to leave the country. And that's about slightly under 1 million people. I think that is a good thing. I think that's going to increase his standing. But yet I could already hear the shrill propaganda coming out of the left. Oh, they're separating families. They're ripping babies away from mothers and whatnot. What do you hear on the street with regard to this issue, and how is this, do you think, going to play out?
It's amazing how many people are dragging their feet on the immigration issue. You hear a lot of people talking on TV cameras about it, but you don't actually see Republicans trying to get something done in this space, and they won't make a hard stand, and they don't have the stomach to do it. Because if you remember the last time when the government was shut down for just a few days at a time, and it was only a partial government shutdown, everyone was thinking, oh, this is a crisis. We need to just give them what they want, and we'll put off wall funding or actual comprehensive immigration reform off to another time. So you hear a lot of people talking about it, but unfortunately there are only a select few people who are actually serious about getting something done.
I see, because I mean they've kicked the can down the road for the past 20 years.
Yeah.
And of course on the left you have people like Beto who want to tear down the fences in El Paso. I mean, and open the borders. So, I mean, I think it's an issue that if phrased properly would augur well for the Republicans, because it's an appeal to labor. It's an appeal to the domestic American life, really, the idea that we're going to simply enforce the law as it stands. Yeah. So your group, talk a little bit about what FreedomWorks is doing right now, how people can reach you, how can people get more information. You've got an excellent website.
I appreciate it. Yeah, our website, freedomworks.org, has all the basic information that you need. We have blog posts. We post any white papers that we published. One just recently came out from me on prescription drug pricing, if you want to give that a look. We also have a great Facebook page where we do live streams with policy experts and members of Congress. I believe we're actually going to be having Matt Gaetz, congressman from Florida, into our office tomorrow to do a live stream on term limits. It's all exciting content there. And then on our Twitter page, @FreedomWorks. And what FreedomWorks seeks to do is educate activists across the country. A lot of groups in Washington put out very dense content that only elected officials and staff can understand. And you mentioned it, saying a lot of big words and complicated legal language get used in Washington, and people across America can't understand, and that's how they don't know what's going on in Washington. And that's how a lot of people here get away with what they do, because they just bank on everyday Americans not understanding what's going on. So we try and simplify it as best we can, break it down into terms people can understand, and we put it out in digestible content like blog posts or like short white papers, but with simplified language and statistics that people can wrap their heads around. So we try and engage grassroots instead of just lobbyists or officials or staff. We try and bring grassroots from across America into it, and that's how we try to be unique that way.
Well, I mean, the site's very informative. I look at it. I urge my listeners and viewers to look at it, just especially as we move into the election season, to kind of cut through the usual BS and get to what the heck is going on up there in Capitol Hill. Dan Savickas, I want to thank you for joining me this afternoon. Great talking with you. We'll do it again soon.
Yeah, appreciate it. Good being with you.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.